Menus with React. In visualization, it's very useful to introduce menus so that users can interactively select what, for example, X and Y mean. Instead of changing code so that X is horsepower and Y is weight, you could use menus to do it. Before we put menus on our scatterplot, let's just first make a menu with React to see how we can do that part. Select is the built-in HTML tag for making drop-down menus. Let's take a look at the MDN page for select. Here's a demo that shows a drop-down menu with different options, and you can click on each one. There's an outer select element, which defines the menu, and then there are inner option elements, which define each entry in the drop-down. Before we use select, I'd like to show you some of the drawbacks to it. This is how a select element will appear in various browsers on various operating systems. The biggest drawback of using the select element is that you can't really style it with CSS. You can try, but the things that drop down, you can't touch them with CSS. But still, I do love to use the select element as a first pass at menus, just to get something working, and then iterate from there, perhaps adopting various other libraries that make drop-down menus that are stylable. For example, React Dropdown or React Select. But let's proceed for the meantime with a native select element. Let's get that going in React. I'll start by forking this smiley face with React and D3. This is the closest thing we have to a React starter. I'm going to delete everything that we don't need, like this commented out code, the D3 library, all this code, and all this code. Now I'll just make a div that says, Hello React. I think I'll keep this around because this will be useful as a React starter. React starter code. And then I'll fork this to make our example of menus with React. I think what I'll do is I'll just start by copying this example code out of MDN, and then I'll just paste it in our index.js inside of this div. And it seems to have worked. We've got our menu here. It's really tiny. I think I'll just make it a bit bigger by setting the font size on the body to be, say, 5 EM. That doesn't touch our select element, though. Let me try to style our select element to have a larger font size. Okay, there we go. As you can see, it's a bit painful trying to style the stuff with CSS. I think what we need to do here is also style the options within the select. I'll set the font size of those to be 1 EM. Now let's see if we open this up. They're still huge. What if we try R EM instead? Okay, now these are the right size. You may be asking yourself, what the heck is REM? MDN says REM values were invented in order to sidestep the compounding problem. REM values are relative to the root HTML element, not the parent element. Back in our example, if we change this back to EM, setting the font size of our option elements within the select element to 1 EM, somehow it's relative to the parent, and I don't know, it doesn't even seem to be working. Or maybe it considers 5 EM to be 1 EM or something like that, because this seems about 5 times as large as its parent. Honestly, I don't really know. But if we use REM, the size is relative to the HTML element, and we get a reasonable looking size for our entries. So I'll just clean this up a little. I think I'll make it a bit smaller, say 4 EM. Now this label is a bit small, so I think I'll apply this font size to our label as well. All right, now that we've got this far, it's time to get to the meat and potatoes of what it is we're doing here. Namely, we're going to really use React to manage and deal with this menu. That includes passing in the options as a prop and also listening for changes in the selected option and then using some kind of React state to keep track of that selected option. That will pave the way forward for using that state in downstream logic like a scatterplot. In our index.js, we've got this app that's just rendering these raw DOM elements. I'd like to start componentizing this select. I think I'll make a component here and call it dropdown. This will be a function that returns some JSX, and I think what I'll do is I'll just copy all of this stuff into this component, and then we can use the dropdown component in our app like this, and we've got this dropdown back. These options should be configurable by the user of this component. I think I'll introduce an options prop, and I'll define it to be the value of an options variable, which we can define up here to be an array of option objects. What does each of these options really consist of? Well, there are pretty much two things. There's the value and then there's the label. The value is used as sort of a unique ID. It's typically referenced in code so that you know which thing was selected. And the label here is what you see in the menu when you open it. Since each of these options is defined by a value and a label, we can craft these options objects to reflect that. So they can have a value property of, say, goldfish, and they could also have a label property, for example, goldfish with an uppercase G. Now that we've got our goldfish entry sorted out, we can do the same for dog, cat, hamster, parrot, and spider, and then just clean this up, and now we've got our options object defined. So we've defined this options object, and we're passing it into our dropdown component as a prop called options, but in the dropdown component, we're not using it yet. First, we need to unpack the options prop, and then we can generate these option entries based on that options prop. By using options.map, we can take each one of these option objects and transform it into JSX that looks something like this one, where the value is set to be option.value, and the label, this text here, is set to be option.label. Now it seems to be working again. We can clean this up just a bit by using ES6 destructuring here, where each option object can be destructured into local variables for value and label. Now we can get rid of this option dot in both of these places. In my opinion, this please choose an option entry is not really required, so I'm just going to delete that. The last thing I'd like to make configurable is the ID. But is this ID really important? Well, if we go back to the MDN select example, it uses this ID in this for attribute of the label. And why would it be doing that? It says here, it is given an ID attribute to enable it to be associated with a label for accessibility purposes. In general, with the label element, the attribute for is the ID of a labelable form-related element. This is how you set up a labeled control. The main benefit of doing this is that it allows you to click on the label and it will be treated like clicking on the associated input element or form element, in our case, the dropdown. Screen readers for the visually impaired also make use of this. That's why we should keep this ID around in our select element, but it should be customizable. I think I'll introduce a new prop called ID along with our options prop. And then when we invoke this component, we can pass an ID of pet-select so that it matches with our label. Now we retain that behavior where clicking on the label is similar to clicking on the drop-down menu itself. All right, we've set up this menu. Now it's time to listen for changes and use React State to keep track of which option is currently selected. We need that in order to control anything using this drop-down menu. The main idea is to use state to keep track of the selected option. I'm going to change this app component from using parentheses to using curly braces, and then explicitly returning this JSX so that we can introduce the state. I'll call it selected option. Then we can define a setter called setSelectedOption, and we'll use the React hook useState. Come to think of it, it's actually the value that we want to keep track of in the state, not the entire option object. So I think I'll call it selectedValue instead. And the setter would be setSelectedValue. Then we can pass a function into our drop-down component called onSelectedValueChange, and this can just be setSelectedValue. In our drop-down component, we can unpack that new prop, and then on the select element, we can use the onChange event listener, where we can pass a callback that takes as input an event. And I think we can use event.target.value, and we can pass that into our callback prop on selected value change. I think this should work. In order to test it out, let me just console.log selected value. It looks like we've got an error. Oh, useState is not defined. That's because we never did import it. Import useState from React. Now let's see if it works. We've got undefined printed out, and that makes sense because the first render selected value will be undefined because we didn't pass anything in to useState. But if we select something, now it prints out cat, lowercase, which is the value for the corresponding label that we select. All right, it's working. This is how you can use state in React to keep track of the selected value. The last remaining thing here is the initial value. What if your code has some value that you want to initialize the menu to? Let's say, for example, we'd like to initialize the menu to have hamster selected. The way I would like to do this is to pass some initial value into our call to useState. And then we can define initial value to be hamster. Currently, the first value in the list is selected by default. Our goal now is to use the selected value to actually set the selected value when this menu is initialized. The first step of that is having the dropdown know about the selected value. So we can pass in a selected value prop and set it to be selected value, our state. Now, inside of our dropdown component, we can unpack that new prop, selected value, and we need to somehow tell this select element that one of these specific values or options is currently selected. According to the MDN documentation for option, it accepts a selected attribute, a Boolean attribute, meaning true, false, that indicates that the option is initially selected. So when we create these option elements, we can pass the selected attribute. And we can define it to be a Boolean value, true or false, that we want to be true if value, namely the value of this particular option, is the same as selected value, the one that's passed in from the props. Now that we've done that, see that the menu is initialized to be hamster, and we can still change it with no problems. And I'll just clean up the formatting a bit. And finally, we can take this logic for drop-down menus and put it into a separate file called dropdown.js. I'll paste that logic, and then we can export this. And we do need to have React in scope. And then in index.js, we can import dropdown from /dropdown. And everything works again. That's all for menus with React.